Aloha mai kakou. Thank you folks for joining us today for this Kuka Kuka. Mahalo to the College of Social Sciences and Huiaina Pili, Ruben and Ula for allowing us to use the space, and of course Kamakana for helping organize this talk story with me. Now let's get into introducing Dr. Sai. Sakaria Laisene Auelua-Toomey was born and raised on Oahu. He attended St. Louis School and Kalani High School before continuing his education at Honolulu Community College, where he earned an AA in liberal arts. He then went on to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he received a BA in psychology and communicology and later completed his Ph.D. in psychology at Stanford University. Currently, he is a social psychologist in the Department of Psychology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His research focuses on racism as a system of advantage based on race, perpetuated through the interplay between psychological processes and social contexts. He employs a range of methodologies, including surveys, field experiments, archival analysis, and natural language processing to investigate how social contexts shape individuals' expressions of and responses to racism across various domains, integrating diverse perspectives through his work. Mahalo for joining us today. Thank
you. I want to say mahalo to Kahini and Kamakana for inviting me to be a part of this, and to Ruben and Ula and the broader Access Lounge for allowing me to be here, talk about my work, and hang out with y'all today. Yeah, my name is Sakaria Laisene Auelua-Toomey. I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I'm doing in racism in academia. At any point we get any questions, any broader discussions, please feel free to raise your hand or something, or just chime in. And the people on Zoom too, yeah, don't be afraid. Yeah, if you have questions or anything, jump on in and we can have a conversation. Everyone can hear me? Everyone good?
Yes.
Can see the slide? All right, on. Okay. So at the broadest level, a lot of the research that I do is I study racism, right? I think about race and racism in this broad, in a US context. And in psychology, a lot of times when we think about racism, right, we think about it at the level of individual. Psychology is the study of the individual mind, right? And so often when racism is studied in psychology, we're thinking about it as individual prejudice, individual discrimination, individual biases, right? We see that at this level. But in my work, I like to define racism as a system of advantage based on race, right? And this system of advantage based on race is maintained by these individual level biases, prejudice, and discriminations, right? But it's also shaped by this interplay with our social context, right? Our social contexts are shaping how we sort of maneuver in these different environments, which may include these biases, discrimination, and prejudices that we might have. And both of these things interact with each other to reinforce these racial advantages, right? And so I see racism as these advantages based on race that is maintained and reinforced by this interplay. And so to give a little example about what that sort of process looks like, I'll briefly go over my work on looking at racism in romantic relationships. And so when I talk about this work, I like to start with the experience I had growing up. This is me and my brother right here. I'm the one going like this. And I just noticed I give him a bad haircut. My mom gets the kind of bowl on head actions. Cutting like this. My mom always cut my hair. But growing up here in Hawaii, probably don't have to tell all of you this, but one of the first things that people ask of you, when you first meet somebody is, what are you, right? And what they mean by this is, what's your racial, ethnic background? Where are you from? And so growing up, I would tell people I'm Afakasi, right? Or I'm half Samoan, half white, something around this. And when I tell them this, one of the things that they say right away is like, oh, where is Samoa your dad from? Or where is your family in Samoa, your dad's side family from? And so like, how do they know this, right? How do they know that my dad's Samoan and my mom's white? Are they right? And they're correct, right? That's my dad. My dad is Samoan. My mom is white. She's from Pennsylvania. So how do they know this, right? I didn't say anything about my parents. So how are they thinking about this? And so one possibility you know, that they might think this is that they have beliefs about how these two groups are attracted to each other, right? That is, they might believe that Samoan men and white women are more likely to find each other attractive than white men and Samoan women, right? And so among other beliefs that people have about these groups in terms masculinity, femininity, you know, status, they might have beliefs about how these groups are attracted to each other. And so what I wanted to test was, do people have beliefs about the racial groups that find them attractive, right? Or the ethnic groups that find them attractive? And if so, might those beliefs shape our own attraction towards those groups? And so to answer this question, I examined heterosexual interracial relationships in a broader US context, right? Where we see two of the most common interracial relationships are between Asian women and white men, and white women and Black men. We're less likely to see the opposite, right? We're less likely to see relationships between Asian men, right, and white women, and between Black women and white men compared to these, right? And we're even far less likely to see relationships that look like this: Asian women and Black men, and Black women and Asian men, right? And so why is that? Why might this happen? And so what I wanted to test again was whether people's beliefs about where they believe they are attracted to might also influence who they are attracted to. And so, for example, do Asian women, on average, believe that they are more attractive to white men than they are to Black men? And if so, might that reinforce Asian women to seek out relationships with white men over Black men, right? And so essentially, what I found in my research is that on average, people do hold these beliefs, right? Asian and Black Americans believe they are more attractive to white Americans than to each other. And this reinforces their preferences for attraction and opportunities to date white Americans over each other, right? And so another reason we may see these patterns in our interracial relationships are that Asian and Black Americans believe they are more attracted to white people than to each other, which therefore reinforces these relationships, among other factors as well. And so I'm happy to go more into depth on that research after the talk, or we can discuss them now. But I wanted to give a very quick glimpse of that work, because this was sort of the first project that I engaged with as a race scholar, or somebody who critically examines race or racism in the US context. And so a salient part of that experience was sort of navigating the publication system, right? Where am I going to put this research out? And at first this was rough, right? I was aiming for the stars, you know, aiming for the big journals. And so the first place I submitted this paper to was one of the top journals in psychology, in which they said, it is commendable that you, it is commendable that you brought in minorities' perspectives to this research. However, I remain underwhelmed by the lack of theoretical contributions this series of studies makes to the literature. I'm sorry to report that I cannot accept your paper for publication. I was crushed, right? Part of the theoretical contributions that I wanted to contribute to psychology was that you need racially marginalized perspectives to understand how people are navigating this interracial dating market, right? And so I was crushed. I thought, well, maybe psychology isn't for me. Maybe the field of psychology doesn't value the perspectives of racially marginalized groups. Eventually, you know, overcame that, sought out other journals, and submitted to another journal in which they said, I'll come straight to the point. This is the best manuscript I've had the pleasure of handling in my 8 years as an associate editor. Feeling good, right, after that one. So why am I talking about this, right? Why am I talking about my rejection in psychology? And I do want to say, rejection happens as a part of the process in many of these, how we're thinking about doing research. And I was a little salty. I'm not bringing it up because I'm salty about that. But I bring up this experience because it's one of the many experiences that race scholars sort of face, right, in academia, or scholars that think critically about race and racism. And so a guiding question throughout my dissertation was, how is race scholarship evaluated in psychology? And so this is a piece that's part of a series called The Study of the Samoan Savage by Samoan artist and Pafinge artist Yuki Kihara. And I appreciate this piece because it's a great reminder that race scholarship took a very different meaning, right, back in the day, and where much of the scholarship on race was focused on building pseudoscientific evidence for the pseudoscientific evidence for the superiority of white intelligence, right? Building that case there. And I bring up this history to highlight that not just, the science had this white supremacist history, but much of the methodologies and values that we built on that science still contribute to how we think about science today. Spaces in which knowledge production was strictly reserved for white scholars and white perspectives, right? And many cases for these white supremacist agendas. So for example, it's commonly taught that good research, right, good science requires objectivity, right, or neutrality, where researchers hold this neutral or outsider perspective. They're kind of distanced from the communities that they sample. And so under this appeal for objectivity, it's argued, for instance, that it's more objective for white scholars who have no ties to Samoan communities to study the psychology of Samoan communities. Because a Samoan scholar might be too close to this community, might bias, right? That's the idea that they're holding here. However, it's not the case, right, that it's more objective for a Samoan scholar to study white communities, right? And nor is it the case that it's less objective for white scholars to study white communities, right? And that's the majority of psychology, right? That's the majority of science and what it looks like now, right? And so the maintenance of values and norms that privilege whiteness in psychology, like ideas around objectivity, results in the devaluation and exclusion of scholars and scholarship that challenges that status quo, right? Which is referred to in the literature as epistemic exclusion. And so in my work, I build upon this literature on epistemic exclusion by highlighting how psychology PhD students both reflect and reinforce these white scientific values in the publication process, which continue to devalue and exclude race scholars and scholarship from their work. And so in the first half of the talk, I'm going to highlight a mode in which psychology PhD students express these white scientific values by differentially shaping how they communicate about research based on the sample, the race of the sample, right? The diversity of the sample. And in the second half of the talk, I'm going to highlight a way in which psychology PhD students sort of react to these white scientific values, right? By differentially engaging with journals based on the racial representation of who's the editorial boards of these journals, right? Who's making the decisions of these journals. And so with that, I'll go ahead and start with sample diversity, thinking about the ways that PhD students are sort of expressing white scientific values. So now I mentioned before, what sparked my interest in examining interracial relationships was my experience growing up back home. And originally I wanted to examine this process here in Hawaii with broader Pacific Islanders. However, ultimately I ended up examining racial preferences in a broader US context with Asian, Black, and white Americans. And I did this for a couple of reasons. First, collecting samples of Pacific Islanders using sort of these online platforms are very expensive. For instance, having a white American take a 5-minute survey costs about maybe $1, $2, right? Having a Pacific Islander participant take one of these surveys, a 5-minute survey, costs $25 for this, right? And that's not going to the participant. This is going to the panel, right? The crowdsourcing panel. So it's very expensive, especially when your institution is not supporting a lot of these community sampling processes. But second, I also endorse beliefs about how these perspectives would be valued in psychology, right? I believe that Samoan perspectives would not be valued in psychology, right? And so those beliefs are not unwarranted. That is, in the US, we find that white experiences and perspectives are often conceptualized as more advanced, more neutral, and more normal compared to racially marginalized experiences, right? which is referred to as the white racial frame. And we see this framework take shape in psychology as well. As psychologist Robert Guthrie observed that even the rat was white, right? Even the rat was white in our psychology studies. Just illustrating that even the smallest details of mainstream psychological science defaults to these white norms. For instance, I'm sure many scholars in here have experienced this, but when researchers or when scholars sort of examine or include perspectives from racially marginalized communities, it's often required, by reviewers, editors, or collaborators that they have also a control group, right? A white racial control group to compare those perspectives to as well, right? Given that white Americans are often perceived as the neutral standard from which to judge all others. Now, not only does this framework impact, sort of the comparisons we need to make when we do research with racially diverse communities, but it also impacts how we need to communicate about participants from racially marginalized communities. So I'm about to show you a figure of article titles that mention race in psychology journals, where on the y-axis, the vertical line, we have the proportion of articles that mention race, right? That mention race in the title. And on the x-axis, we have the percentage of white participants within those articles. And so what we find in this archival analysis is that articles with larger percentages of white participants are less likely to mention race in the titles of their papers, right? So on this side of the graph, where we have papers that have less percentage of white participants, more percentages of non-white participants, we might see article titles such as, "Are Asians Forgetful? Perception, Retention, and Recall in Episodic Remembering," suggesting that the research here is only applicable to Asians, right? Nobody else, just Asians in here. However, on the other side of the graph, right, we might run into article titles such as, "Do infants show social preferences for people differing in race?" Suggesting that the research here, right, is applicable to all of humanity, right? Not just white people, not just Asians, everybody is here, right? So now what this archival analysis doesn't show, though, is like, why does this occur? What's happening here? There are two possibilities that among other possibilities that could be happening. One possibility, is through the peer review process, when we're putting our research in these journals, we're getting feedback saying, "Hey, you need to change that article, you need to title to something else." Our collaborators are maybe saying, "Hey, we need to make this more generalizable or something." And so through this peer review process, that's where it's happening. Now, another possibility, not mutually exclusive from the last, is that maybe, as scholars who are raised in a field that values these white scientific norms, we are also endorsing these norms, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so as we're thinking about our research, as we're collecting our samples, we may be intentionally including the race, right, of our participants in our titles, or not, depending on the sample diversity, right? And so in this paper, I sought to experimentally test if this was the case within our psychology PhD students, and whether we can do something about this through policy that could help sort of dismantle and disrupt those biases. And so to collect participants for the study, I created a database of PhD students by first identifying 292 ranked universities with social science PhD programs. And I developed sort of a script that allowed me to collect the names and emails from PhD students across these social science programs. So we had about 24,000 PhD students, and then I emailed a small subset of PhD students from psychology programs, in which we got about 1,000 responses from these students. So for study one, I'll show you, we had about 318 responses. And for study two, we had about 691 responses. And I just wanted to point out that we had a majority white PhD students in both of these studies, which is largely reflective of this, racially exclusive institution and history. We did not have enough power to kind of examine differences between racial groups, but we did try to examine marginalized students versus white students, and we did not see any differences though in what I'm about to show you. So the results that I'm about to show you are the aggregate across all PhD students. So for the experiment for study 1, all participants were randomly assigned to read one of two studies. Participants assigned to the white condition read about a made-up drug called sodalatrium that could help depression, right? And they read about this study with white Americans. Participants assigned to the black condition read about the same exact study, right? Everything's exactly the same, except this time they read that they used black Americans as was the sample for that study, right? Only difference that they had between these conditions was that. And so I wanted to see whether this simple change was enough to impact how people communicate about these findings. And so after reading about the research, participants were then asked to generate a research title as no longer than 10 words, list 5 keywords that describe the study, and detail how they would summarize this research to a friend. So after we collected responses, we had 2 trained research assistants go through, see whether they explicitly mentioned race or not. And what we found is, so at the bottom, we have our black condition and our white condition showing like what research they read. And then what you're going to see on the y-axis is the proportion of titles that mention race. So what we find, so similar to what we see in archival analysis, what we find is that when psychology students read about research conducted with black participants, they're more likely to mention race in their titles, in their keywords, and in their summaries than one conducting reading about the same exact research with white participants, right? Suggesting that even in this next generation of psychologists, when left to their own devices, that these research practices reflect and reinforce this white racial frame, right? And so how can we do this, right? How can we address this? What can we do to sort of fix this? And so in study 2, I wanted to examine how a policy standardizing participant reporting procedures might disrupt this or correct this inequality. And so again, participants read our fictitious research study, either in a black or white condition, but they were further randomized to either be in our modifier or no modifier condition. In the modifier condition, we have participants before they rated their or generated their titles. We have participants read this that said, please include information about the racial ethnic background of participants in the title. And this is similar to what is currently being done in some of the American Psychological Association journals, right? Where they're trying to standardize how we're reporting about the racial demographics of our samples. However, there's no data to suggest that people are actually complying to this, or whether it would be more effective than a more colorblind policy, which is actually being pushed by some psychologists, that says, please do not include information about the racial ethnic background of the participants in that title, right? So I wanted to see how these two policies might shape compliance and also how it might impact this white racial frame. So participants then generated a research title, where again, have 2 trained research assistants go through and code for whether they mention race or not. We have our modifier condition, no modifier. The difference in the color of the bars indicate whether they were assigned to the black or white condition as well. And so first, looking at our modifier condition, we find that no significant difference, right? People are mentioning race at sort of the same rates between our black and white conditions, right? Suggesting that having a policy that explicitly asks or requests researchers to include race, that they follow instructions, right? They do this. Now, what about our no modifier condition, and where we ask participants to not mention race? Interestingly, we see it drop down, right? We see the mentioning of race drop down, but we still see this issue happening, and where our black participants in our black condition are still mentioning the race of their sample in the titles compared to our white condition, right? suggesting that a colorblind type of policy would not be sort of effective in addressing this white racial frame, right? And this is important because part of the issue of what makes a white racial frame so powerful is sort of the invisibility of white identity or the non-racialization of white identity, right? And so now that we had this data on this inequality, I was next interested in developing sort of a deeper understanding of like how PhD students might react to one of these policies, right? So first, I asked participants to read about a policy that would require researchers to include racial or ethnic background, right? And just ask, what are your thoughts about this? What are your thoughts about this policy? And I asked whether they supported a policy like this. And on average, PhD students were pretty supportive, right? Scale from 1 to 7, they're hitting a 5. This is pretty supportive of this policy. But of course, not all students were supportive of this, right? And so I wanted to know, what are the reasons people are supportive for this and what are the reasons that they aren't, right? And so to summarize the content of participants' open-ended responses, I use this technique called latent derelict allocation topic modeling that clusters these responses into 20 topics. So it's similar to factor analyses, where it's a data-driven technique that produces these clusters of words that occur in similar semantic contexts, which is referred to as a topic. So from the output of this model, I can see the relative percentages of how much of each topic language is being used by PhD students and how it varies by condition, right? This was a response to white scientific values, right? This is a response, we can talk about this later. But originally, the way that I did this was sort of qualitatively coding for things, right? But reviewers push back around that stuff because they want something quantifiable. And so this is sort of a response. We can talk about that one later. So here I'll show you the generated topics that were both positively and negatively correlated with policy support. So first, what were thoughts of people who are more supportive of such a policy? I found that policy support was positively associated with language around reducing racial biases and generalizability, right? Where people were mentioning that such a policy would help in these generalizability biases, bringing forward a lot of these majority identities, right? Highlighting minority identities, and increasing transparency of some of the limitations of the research that's happened, right? So here's a sort of a representative quote of these topics that say, having a title with racial or ethnic background of study samples is the first step to tell the reader that these results are not generalizable and should only be relevant to the population. So what about some of the thoughts for people who were less supportive of this policy? For the negatively associated topics, I found that people were mentioning multiple identities, right? How are we going to have how are we going to input the racial identities of people who don't identify with solely one race, right, or multiple races? That could be something hard to place on in just the title, right? And on a similar note, people were also who did not support it also were talking about where we should place this information. Maybe not the title. The title isn't the best place to put this. Maybe the abstract, maybe the method section, or the results section, right? Somewhere else, but not in the title, right? So just going to show representative quote that says, I don't know if it's necessary to mention the sample and article titles, as many times ethnic and racial groups and studies can be mixed, complicated, or cannot be easily described in article title, right? So overall, I found in this study, right, in this paper, that when left to their own devices, even this next generation of psychologists can reinforce these white racial frames in how they're communicating about their research, right, based on the sample diversity. However, I also found that this framework can be disrupted by enacting policy that standardizes how we're reporting our research, our samples in our research, right? Mainly making sure that white identity and white participants are being included in the research, right? In psychology, this is mostly problematic in our cognitive and neuroscience spaces, in which largely a lot of this research, a lot of the sample demographics are ignored and not placed in it. So thinking about standardizing how we're reporting these samples. And finally, we found that scholars are overall supportive of standardizing sample reporting practices. believing that it'll help reduce this white racial frame. But of course, which we agree also, that they don't agree that maybe the title is the best place to put this. So we agree that maybe the abstract or the method section might be a better place to put a lot of this information. All right, so now I discussed the way, right, in which these scholars sort of express these white scientific values and how they're communicating about research. In the next study, I want to show you how PhD students are reacting to these white scientific values by differentially engaging with journals based on the racial diversity. And so I want to illustrate this issue at hand with a little thought experiment. So let's imagine, oh, who's that? This young scholar over here, just doing his PhD, doing some research on thinking about racism in our interracial romantic relationships. We'll call him a race scholar because he does critical research on race and race. Now, this race scholar has collected, analyzed a bunch of data, beginning to write up his paper, but now he needs to start thinking about what journal he'll send this research to, right? So he asked Kanaka and say, hey, what journal should I send this research to? Kanaka was like, you know what, I've been reading on some journals, and I think you should probably send this research to either the Journal of Psychology or the Psychology Journal. And so this race scholar, he does his due diligence, looks into both journals, sees, oh, you know what, both journals have equal impact factors. They got equal amount of monthly downloads, but he sees something interesting about this, right? This race scholar recognizes and realizes that the Journal of Psychology, like most psychology journals, right, has a white editorial board, majority white editorial board. However, in the Psychology Journal, it has a little bit more diverse editorial board, right? So now, given this information, what journal do you think this race scholar is going to submit to? Show of hands if you think it's this one. Show of hands if you think it's this one. That's what I'm about to show you, right? That's the work that I'm about to show you today. Now, one question is, why might we think that a race scholar would be more likely to submit to this diverse editorial board than the majority white editorial board? Our research shows that there are multiple reasons that for this possibility. Considering that race scholarship has a particular focus on highlighting experiences of racially marginalized groups, we might assume that race scholars believe that white editorial boards may not have the personal or lived experience to understand a lot of the experiences that we want to communicate and talk about, right? They don't engage with those experiences in the same way that we do. We might also assume that race scholars believe that a white editorial board might not find research on race as important or relevant, given that research shows that white communities often don't see race as an important aspect of life. And considering that race scholarship often highlights the ways in which racialization contributes, right, to structural racial advantages, race scholars might believe that white editorial boards might be threatened by this research, given that research shows white communities often deny, dismantle, and distance from evidence that highlights white advantages. And so taken together, race scholars might expect that their research would be less valued by white editorial boards than by diverse editorial boards. And again, in psychology, at least, these beliefs are definitely not unwarranted. As in this archival analysis, we found that in psychology, a majority of journal editorial boards are white. And under these white editorial boards, we find that only 4% of articles cover race scholarship, right? But under editors-in-chief of color, race-related articles triples and accounts for 12% of articles published. And it's a huge issue, right, for race scholars. These are barriers to how race scholars progress in academia. Publications that shape career progression, determine whether or not they stay in academia, whether or not they get tenure, and whether or not one day, whether they become editors themselves in these journals, right? And more importantly, this disparity restricts the advancement of race scholarship that's necessary to dismantle real-world racism. And so the question that I had was, how might beliefs about where one's scholarship is valued shape how scholars navigate this publication process? So in line with your sort of thought experiment that we just did, just as research shows in employment that the diversity of employees in companies matters for whether applicants of color or applicants who care about diversity decide to engage with those companies, I'm going to show you evidence that the diversity of journal editorial boards matters for whether race scholars decide to engage with those journals or submit their research to those journals. So how do I do this? So first, I did test this framework solely in psychology, but more recent research, I brought in this to the broader social sciences. So I'm going to just show you the research that I've aggregated from the broader social sciences, which includes anthropology, psychology, sociology, communications, business, political science, education, and economics. So using that same database that I mentioned in the first study, I sent it out a more broader email to these different programs, in which we had about 3,300 responses from social science PhD students. Now, to determine whether PhD students were race scholars or non-race scholars, I asked participants 2 questions. Do you intentionally collect racially diverse samples in your research? And is race a main focus of your research? Very broad definition of how I'm thinking about race scholarship. We was worried that there weren't many race scholars out there, and we wanted to get as much as possible under this umbrella. So anyone that said yes to any one of those questions, they were included as a race. We identified them as a race scholar. And so just a quick overview, probably from this broader definition of race scholars, we have more race scholars and non-race scholars here. Again, we see the same sort of representation here, right, in our field on race. Happy to come back to this later again if anyone wants to ask any questions. And so at the start of this experiment, all participants read and responded to a modified version of the 2020 journal description of psych science. Just to see what that looks like. Here's an example of the journal description for anthropology, right? I edited the psych science journal description to fit for anthropology. And so anthropology PhD student would read this that says hidden, that's where the journal name is supposed to be, is the leading peer-reviewed journal publishing research spanning the entire spectrum of the science of anthropology, right? It's a very general journal description so that everyone can feel that their research is included in here. So if there was a political science PhD student, instead of anthropology, they say political science. And if it was a psychology, they say psychology, et cetera, right? So in addition to reading this journal description, participants were also randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. In the white editors condition, participants also seen a meet our editors section that had this photo, right, of white editors. In the diverse editors condition, participants seen a meet our editors section with a photo of a more diverse editorial board, right? And in the unspecified editors condition, we did not include any photo, right? And so after they read the journal description, participants were asked, do you think this journal board is racially diverse, right? We just wanted a manipulation check. Are they seeing this the same way that we're thinking they're seeing it? When we showed a white editorial board, yeah, it's not that diverse, right? They're not seeing it as racially diverse, right? When we showed a diverse editorial board, oh, that's a little bit more diverse, right? They see the the editorial board as more racially diverse. But what about when we did not show them an editorial board? They see, it's a little bit more diverse than our white editorial board, but still can do some work, right? There's still some improvement compared to our diverse editorial board. And so I just want to put that in perspective, right? So we additionally asked participants, what journal in your discipline would most people conceptualize as the most impactful, right? What is the most impactful journal in your field? And so when we asked participants, we then asked participants to rate the diversity of those journals. But just because we have some broad fields in here, I just wanted to give you an idea of what are the top journals that these PhD students listed by field. So in psychology, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. In political science, American Political Science Review. In sociology, American Sociological Review. And in anthropology, American anthropology, we see a theme right here, right? American, American, American in this. And then what else did I put? In communication, we have the Journal of Communication, right? So these are the journals where PhD students mentioned are the most, or most frequently mentioned are the most impactful journals in their field. And so we asked them, what is the perceived diversity of those journals? And on average, people rated that journal as a 2.67, right? Which is similar to what we're seeing on our unspecified journals, right? Which is sort of the reality of PhD students are interacting with this. No journals posting up their editorial board photos, right? You get a list of names, you don't know what they are unless you're like looking into them, right? But what does that mean for scholars who engage with those journals? So after reading the journal description, participants answer 6 Likert scale-like questions on their beliefs about the journal in random order. I'm going to go over the 3 more important ones, which are, do you think this journal would evaluate your research fairly? Do you think this journal would publish your research? And would you submit your research to this journal for publication? So again, this is the aggregate of all fields, right? All PhD students in all fields. We ran a linear mixed effects model because we wanted to run one per field. We just didn't have enough participants. But in our model, it determined that field would explain little to no variation in the differences between here. So this is the aggregate of everyone. All right, what do we find? So starting with our unspecified editorial board, right? Where they see no photo of any journal editorial board. We see that non-race scholars, compared to race scholars, were more likely to believe that their research would be evaluated fairly, or more likely to believe that their research would be published by the journal, and were more likely to submit their journal for publication, right? These are non-race scholars. You already see an advantage for these non-race scholars in how they believe their research is valued and whether they submit. But what about for our white editorial board? We see the same sort of thing pop up in our white editorial boards, right? Race scholars are less likely to believe that their research would be valued or would be evaluated fairly, less likely to believe that their research would be published, and less willing to submit to those journals for publication compared to non-race scholars, right? So whether it's whether you don't see an editorial board or whether you explicitly see a white editorial board, these scholars are seeing the same thing here, right? They see these journals in the same way. Now, what happens when you show a racially diverse editorial board? So not only do you see those scholars' responses increase, but you see that difference between non-race scholars and race scholars disappear, right? Where they're equally as likely to believe that their research would be evaluated fairly, equally as likely to believe that their research would be published, and equally as likely to submit their research to that journal for publication, right? So now that we have this data about these relationship between our editorial boards and our scholars' beliefs and how they engage with this journal, I was next interested in developing an understanding of how they would react to policies of this or changing how we're diversifying our journal editorial boards. And so I asked participants, do you think that journal editorial boards should be racially diverse? 1, definitely not, to 5, definitely yes. And additionally, and on average, most people believe that their journal editorial boards should be racially diverse. But additionally, I asked them to please explain your rationale or reasoning for that question, right? So again, I wanted to see what are reasons people are saying, yeah, it should be diverse, and what are reasons they say it shouldn't. So first, I'll start with rationales. Again, I coded the open-ended response with these latent derelict allocation topic models. And so our model predicted that people with high support for diversifying editorial boards often mentioned that doing so would dismantle aspects of racism, mentioning a lot of this history of white supremacy, a lot of the racism in the structure of psychology and how of the social sciences and how research is being published. They mentioned that diversifying the journal editorial boards would also help diversifying the samples in the research, right? Given that editorial boards might be more likely to value research from their communities. They mentioned that doing so would increase equitable practices, saying that there would be more fair submissions and evaluations of research. And they said that doing so would also broaden perspectives in the field, right? Bringing in more diverse perspectives in evaluated and also who publishes. And so just a real quick representative quote. People from marginalized racial backgrounds may be more likely to value research that does not conform to traditional standards and may be more likely to fairly evaluate research on underrepresented groups or topics relative to those groups' experiences, right? Kind of capturing those ideas. What about people that are less supportive for diversity? So our model predicted that lesser support for diversifying editorial boards was associated with beliefs that diversifying editorial boards would threaten meritocracy, right? Where they're like, no, we should care about the qualification and the merits of our editorial board and not about the racial representation of their editorial, right? That would threaten our meritocracy here. Some students also reported that diversifying editorial boards might create this minority tax, right? Which is the idea that a lot of times in diverse initiatives or social justice initiatives, it's marginalized groups that are doing much of the work. And that's going unvalued, right, by their institutions and their peers. And so that was a valid concern that some PhD students had. Similarly, some PhD students said that we also should value other forms of diversity, not just racial diversity, but also sexuality, nationality, identity, age, ability, etc. Right? Not just thinking about race, but also other ways that we can diversify in our editorial board. Because we're cutting time, these are some quotes that just say the same thing that I just said. So in addition to gathering insight from these PhD students, I also gathered insights from journal editors from a variety of psychology journals, right? Our mainstream journals. And in my paper, I discussed these strategies on how to recruit, attract, and support these editorial board, more diverse editorial boards, but I'll go over 3 of the more important factors, which are first and foremost, we need to recruit from diverse networks. Many of these journal editorial boards members mention that the way that they recruit is whoever's in their network, right? So if the network is white, then they're going to recruit from more white networks here. So we need to be more intentional about who we're trying to pull from and how we're our recruiting strategies. We also need to think about how can we attract racially diverse groups to these positions in the first place, right? And we can do so by being transparent about the roles and responsibilities of these things, and also by increasing the diversity of these journal editors. Finally, we need to support diverse group members who enter these positions by tracking and adjusting workflows to ensure that issues such as this minority tax do not manifest in these positions as well, too. All right, summarize. In my work, I describe 2 ways, how race scholars are expressing and reacting to these white scientific values in publication process. Where first I showed you how PhD students are expressing these white scientific values by how they're differentially communicating about research based on diversity of the samples. And in the second half of the talk, I talked about how PhD students are sort of reacting to these white scientific values, right? By differentially engaging and publishing in journals based on the diversity of their editorial board. Ongoing research, I'm doing more of this work and thinking about positionality statements. How might positionality statements, which is more new for psychology and mainstream psychology to be doing in our field. And also how we're thinking about our methodology between quantitative and qualitative. I mentioned earlier that what made me study and learn topic models was this rejection that my qualitative coding that I was doing was not sufficient in this field. So I'd like to end quick interpretation with this piece again, in which again Samoan artist Yuki Kihara captures this history of white supremacist science that not only attempts to possess what it means to do good science, but quite literally attempts to possess what it means to be Samoan, what it means to be Pacific Islander, right? Now, Yuki notes that unbeknown to the scientists, the subject of this study is actually the embodiment of Maui, right? A god and ancestor to many Pacifica people across their histories. And while the scientists might attempt to possess what it means to be Samoan, in this context, the joke is on the scientist, who does not realize that Maui's mana, and by extension, the mana of the Pacifica people. Maui is not possessed here or even possessable, right? And neither are Pacifica people as a whole. And so at the end of the series, Yuki depicts Maui exiting, right, this frame as he escapes this white scientific gaze and the logic of possession through this white scientific methods. And this, I believe, is at the heart of race scholarship, right? Of critical conscious scholarship that we're doing to bring light and challenge this white perspective and to these frames that are being held so that they can never hold complete power to capture the truth of our experiences. And so through my continued work with my scholarship, like Maui, I hope to continue in an effort of exiting this frame. Thank you.
Right. That was awesome. I'd like to open it up for questions. If anyone has questions they'd like to ask Dr. Sai, please do so. Just raise your hand. No pressure to. I have a question on Zoom while you guys think about it. So from Tiare, why is it more expensive to survey Pacific Islanders than it is white participants?
For a lot of these crowdsourcing platforms, they're recruiting in ways that exclude a lot of racially marginalized groups. So they're pulling from universities, from workplaces that are largely underrepresented from marginalized groups. And so they become more expensive because there are too few of them on this platform. And so what the platforms have to do is go out of their way to, from their more convenient sort of sampling locations to more intentionally sampling location, which costs more money in that instance. So that's why they're more expensive. They're harder to obtain, especially because a lot of the researchers and employees that run these crowdsourcing platforms are unfamiliar and distant from these communities. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think you highlighted something in the beginning that psychology is very plastic and challenge that. And then also thinking about some of the foundations that psychology is built on. Fathers of psychology. That's already like demonstrating some of the racism that exists. So I'm wondering, in addition to this publication dissemination, what else can be done to kind of shift and dismantle the structural racism that exists in psychology as a field?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done. The approach that I was looking at and taking in this example is that, you know, one of the approaches is diversifying who are the people in power that are making decisions of what is valued in these journals. And the other one is like, how are we communicating about our research, kind of readdressing how psychology as a science has originally shaped how we're thinking about the samples of different racial groups. But other ways that we can kind of readdress this is shifting how we value, you know, largely about the journals we're publishing in, not just submitting, not having our smaller localized departments and institutions value publications in these mainstream journals, but publications in journals that value our research, right? That are more tied to supporting our communities and the research that we're doing. Which is different from what I'm talking about here, but I think it's something that can really shift it, right? When I do talk about this research, it's kind of bizarre sometimes because I'll talk about this research and I'll be like, yeah, oh, this is great research you got going on. And for example, at Stanford, you know, the top psychology school in the field, they know about this research, we talk about it. And one of the things I ask is like, oh, now that you know this research, how are you going to change it? Yeah. And they're like, well, you know, our higher ups are thinking, you know, they have values and we need to do this. Yeah, we can't really do anything. Our hands are tied. And at the top people in this program, you know, this department, their hands are tied. Like how much further up the chain that we're going, right? And so I really think that it needs to be taken at a localized level of how each department is valuing, right, the publications that we're going. If we're, for example, if the University of Hawaii is trying to maintain and kind of reflect the same values that they have at Stanford, right? Then I have to publish at these journals, right? I can't publish anywhere else. And if we just do that in every space, then the other spaces that we're trying to publish and get our research valued in, there's no incentive, there's less incentives for us to do this in these spaces, and so we get pushed out. So I think changing incentives of like where we're publishing our research and having our institutions back that up, value.
Anybody else have any more questions?
Thank you for your presentation. It was really cool and interesting to see all of that data. I was like, ooh, yeah, check it all. That's a lot of work. So thank you, acknowledge you for that. I just wanted to say, like, what an awesome resource to be able to have access to scrape all those emails and get all those students responding.
Yeah.
And along that line of dissemination, if you consider making an infographic or something and just sending it out to all of them, be like, yo, this is the issue, this is what we did. Think about this, write about this, talk about this in your work so that we can make it more equitable.
Yeah, and it is, there are a lot of, so this was a cool experience, just interacting with a lot of PhD students in various fields, because many of them were supportive, right? And we're like, oh, I want to know about this research when it's published and whatnot. So I had a list of those things, sending them out, hey, here's the research, talk about it with your friends and whatnot. On the other hand, I also had a lot of people who were like pushing against this stuff too. And we're like, you're an embarrassment, or, this is Stanford, what are you doing? They're doing this and that. And so, and a lot of times when dealing with like these kind of stuff, you have to be careful on how you're navigating and how you're communicating. So many of the people that reached out for support, the main thing I do is send their publication, because these are people who are familiar with publication and how to read them, how to disseminate them, how to talk about them. But outside of academics, sort of circles, more can be done on my end in disseminating this.
Hallelujah. I think that is our time. If I just wanted to mahalo everyone for coming out today, and mahalo to you folks on Zoom, and mahalo to you for this presentation.
Thank you.
Mahalo.
And then email me if you have any questions, you want to talk, collaborate on something. I'm happy to talk more. See some chili.
Ahiho. I'm going.
like.